Hello and welcome again. We ended last time with Ricky Gervais's observation that those in charge are actually in that position because they are intrinsically untrustworthy. It's an example of the aphorism, many a true word spoken in jest. Is Gervais's comment true, and how accurate is it? When we examine the topic, we discover that all nations are ruled by a relatively small number of the population, with the vast majority simply doing what they're told. There's a link to a partial explanation of this phenomenon by Tony Benn in the comments box. Yet when we discuss the question of equal rights and equality before the law, virtually everyone agrees with the notion that no one is really born with an innate right to rule, but goes along with the caveat that someone needs to be in charge. This is a classic example of doublethink, where people will hold two contradictory thoughts at once, as if they're in adjacent boxes in the brain, because to resolve the cognitive dissonance thus created requires asking and answering a whole series of awkward questions. That series might begin with, should we be doing something about this? Progressing with, is there actually anything we could be doing? And fairly soon, petering out with, well, I'm only one person, what can I do anyway? Note that these responses begin with discussing the issue from the point of view that as we're speaking of the community in general, it's a collective responsibility, and morphs into the evasion of individual accountability because of the assumption that if everyone else isn't motivated enough to act, that somehow absolves us from doing anything personally. True principles of human interaction, however, apply if there are only two individuals involved and don't change with the number of people in the equation. It's just as wrong to commit a crime if there are many people assenting to it as if there existed only the victim and one perpetrator. So why do the masses go along with the idea of all but a select few being under control, when if they saw this inequality being inflicted by just one person on another, they might well interject and or intervene? It's easy to observe that people have bought into the idea of communal life becoming more complex as populations grow, meaning that resolving disputes about the use of resources and what to do about individuals who commit crimes, along with other social issues, is best left to those who are willing to put themselves forward because of their personal convictions or beliefs that they are more knowledgeable and thus capable of making these more portentous decisions than those they seek to persuade for their votes. And the majority, lacking such convictions of confidence, are willing to defer to these extroverts, contenting themselves with the release from personal responsibility of such burdens. The problem with such an attitude is that it leads us to forget that we are each responsible for conducting not only our own affairs with honesty and integrity, but that in not doing so and allowing ourselves to be herded and behave like a herd, we are abandoning those true principles that bind us just as securely as if there were only one other person to whom we have to account. If we behaved untrustworthily with only one other, perhaps living on a desert island, how long would we expect it to be before that relationship began to break down? Why would it be any different if there were thousands or millions of others? What percentage of the population behaving untrustworthily would it take before the distrust and chaos pervaded the entire community? It's known from studies and from our own personal observations that relatively few people are unwilling to abide by lawful principles, and communities, if properly organised, can usually deal with the problems thus caused. But what if those few, over time, were drawn to artificially constructed nodes of political and social power and began to act in concert, perceiving that they were few, and that if they could but gain and exercise that power over the many, a rich and satisfying lifestyle could be had for themselves, paid for by the sweat and toil of the honest and guileless majority. A mental picture of Napoleon and the pigs, and also Boxer and the other workhorses from Orwell's classic Animal Farm, comes to mind. Many centuries, even millennia ago, people in smaller communities learned that they had to rely on each other to uphold the principles of lawful behaviour, and that it was incumbent on everyone to do their part, that there may not be some knight on a white horse coming over the hills to set everything to rights. Under these sorts of conditions, the concept of the law reflecting the consensus of people's consciences and being upheld when breached by the decisions of a jury comprised of peers of the accused was born. To this day, this form of the people governing themselves, with outside interference being rarely if ever necessary, remains the best system ever devised for the preservation of justice. In these talks, when I speak of justice, I define it as the means of restoring, as far as possible, the circumstances that prevailed before things went wrong for the victim. Those who define justice as a means of retribution or revenue for the state are talking about something entirely different. Justice, for me, is a homophone for just as. It must be restorative, or it's a vain exercise. According to natural law, and indeed as it's spelled out in Magna Carta 1215, the state has no place in questions of justice other than to facilitate the proceedings and, if necessary, provide advice on more complex matters of law. That it has progressively inserted itself into and eventually taken over the process is actually criminal in nature. It is a usurpation of power and a means of extorting the population for the private interests of elite groups. This leads on to the question of what sort of changes would we see when lawful trial by jury processes are restored. Many folks, when discussing this topic, express great misgivings and doubts about the ability of the common people to successfully engage with it, as mentioned before. However, one of the beauties of trial by jury is that the process itself is both educational and enhancing of the qualities of serious introspection, confronting of one's own prejudices, and the ability to peaceably resolve differences of opinion in constructing a cohesive, mutually beneficial community. One of the main reasons for this is the need for the verdicts to be unanimous, to have validity. When we select any 12 people at random, it's a mathematical certainty that there will be many different opinions about virtually any topic one could name. Yet because of the serious nature of the exercise, where the decisions of this jury could have massive implications for the life of the accused, the jurors are compelled by circumstance to focus to the best of their abilities in their deliberations. Each will realize that if the accused is innocent of the charges, that one day it could be themselves who is also inaccurately accused, and may be desperately hoping that their jury will approach their case with the requisite solemnity of purpose. How varied might these opinions and viewpoints be? On many spectra, the extremes can be very far apart indeed. For example, let's consider sexual proclivities and preferences, since most students of human nature accept that this touches upon a host of human motivations and actions. At one end of this spectrum, there are people who we might classify as asexual. They have virtually no interest in sexual activity and live their entire lives without it, experiencing virtually no discomfort in doing so. Clearly, the preferences of these exert almost no effect upon the activities or liberties of others. At the other end, there are those maladjusted souls who can only experience sexual consummation in the act of murdering their usually unwilling partners, with obviously tragic results for their victims. While the odds would be long against it, it's nonetheless possible that one of each of these types could find themselves selected for the same jury, assuming that the latter was as yet undetected. And what if the occasion was a trial for rape or murder? How different might be the initial viewpoints of these two in discussing such a case? On a more mundane level, most of the jurors in a modern trial by jury might well have a collectivist leaning on the matter of politics. Yet in the jury room, they are compelled to focus on the need for individual accountability, including their own in the current circumstances. How much more prevalent or apparent in the community would be the attitude of accepting personal responsibility for one's own life and defending the concept of individual rights if every lawful or legal dispute were conducted by a jury? Might this not have some noticeable effect on public attitudes after a period when many more people than now are called to serve on juries and huge numbers of cases are tossed out because people come to realise that there are no victims, and it's only an exercise in raising state revenue and exerting unauthorised control over people's lives? Clearly, while we may never attain universality in philosophies, we can at least aim for and be content if we can get jurors to understand and accept their responsibilities for upholding the rule of law. Another aspect of many individuals' thinking that could be altered by restoring the trial by jury system would be the completely fallacious idea that democracy consists of people voting in elections. That process is properly termed universal suffrage, but it does not satisfy the definition of democracy. Democracy is usually defined as a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Nowhere in that mantra is it stated that government is to consist of the diktats of those representing the majority having somehow magically acquired the authority to coerce the wills of the minority in matters of policy, is it? Voting for people to occupy positions of public office is an entirely different matter than granting to them unlawful powers which are denied to the rest of us. Why is such a nuanced point an important issue? It's because on the issue of principles, if we inaccurately define terms, we run the very real risk of basing our principles upon a false assumption, which in turn can lead us down a path which will not take us to our chosen destination. Precision in thinking is essential. To illustrate, recently there was an election in the state of Western Australia. When discussing the election with people at the polls and stating that the exercise was futile, the ubiquitous response was, well, if we don't vote, how are we ever going to change things? When it was pointed out that whoever won would not be following the instructions even of those who voted for them, and that this is acknowledged by all, the response was mostly a shrug of the shoulders. In Australia, there is a ludicrous piece of legislation which classifies it as a crime to be convicted of refusing to vote. Of course, one can avoid this conviction by paying a $20 fine under duress to avoid having the matter taken to court. A growing number of people are choosing to do just that. But how many have considered the effect it would have on the weasels assuming unlawful control of the state if 60, 70 or 80% of those on the electoral rolls all did the same and refused to pay the fine? Although virtually everyone complains about the parlous state of government in this country and the rampant corruption which is obvious to all, people are not even prepared to fork out a paltry sum of $20 to publicly register their protest against these things. Instead, they turn out in their droves, like driven sheep, to vote for someone who has no more authority than themselves to be issuing orders, and comply in precisely the manner described by Tony Benn in the aforementioned link. Perhaps it is well past time to consider that continuing to vote is precisely what has led us to our present chaotic state. It is to be hoped that a regularly functioning trial by jury system, which places control of the law firmly in the hands of the people, would highlight these needed changes in thinking in the minds of the population over time. This topic is at the very heart of the resolution of our constitutional problems, and it will continue to be discussed going forward. Meanwhile, I'm taking a needed vacation, but will be back in a couple of months or less to continue. Thank you for your continued attention.